Hi, I'm Rachel, that's Missy far behind me on the bed, and this is my November 2019 reading wrap-up. In one of my recent videos I talked about and figured I'd be doing my November book haul now, but turns out I need to return a couple of these books to the library from my reading, and I'm still waiting for one to arrive in the mail for the book haul, so... That being said, I will try to keep this short and sweet. I ended up reading a lot this month. I read 10 books. Granted, 4 of them were novellas. Another one was a short middle grade book. And 2 of them I listened to on audio, which gave me extra reading time. And in addition, I'll leave you a link to my literary newsletter for November. I write a literary newsletter on my reading and writing blog every month where I have snippets of all of my Goodreads reviews of the books I've read that month. I also have a bit of a TBR, bookish news that caught my fancy, a book pick, a meme, and so forth, so check it out. The first book I read this month was my first sci-fi novella of a long time. This is To Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers, and it's officially one of my anticipated releases of 2019. I'm a big fan of Chambers and her Wayfarer series, and this is both similar and different to that. It is about a crew that is going off into space, deep space, and checking out what could be inhabitable planets for humans. They've also been outfitted with a lot of scientific enhancements so that they can survive different atmospheres than our own. This is somewhat epistolary, although like a lot of novels and such that say that they're epistolary, it tends to go into the usual sort of narrative form a lot of the time. But anyway, our narrator, Ariadne, is trying to send word back to Earth, even though she's aware that time has passed insurmountably, that, because of all the light years that they're traveling and all the time they're spending, in deep sleep as they travel those light years, Earth has moved on a lot without them, and in fact, after a while they stopped getting updates at all, which is sort of a fascinating commentary on Earth history and what can seem important in the moment versus the long stretch of it. There's also an earnestness in this book, the way there's an earnestness in the Wayfarer series about exploration and coming together as a people within the realms of science, which I really like, although this one focuses a lot more on the hard sciences than the Wayfarer series does. There is a controversial bit to the ending, and I think I come across on the side with the people who feel like the ending wasn't very genuine and didn't make a whole lot of sense for the characters. But overall, I thought it was a great reading experience. I love her earnestness. Her mother is an astrophysicist, which I guess helps with knowing all this crazy stuff. And at the end of this book, there is a excerpt of a panel she and her mom did at Worldcon about science and science fiction. And you can tell she is really one of the crowd. She is a geek. She is from the sci-fi fantasy world. Not that I endorse as much gatekeeping as some of the members of the sci-fi fantasy club seem to do, but you can tell she has a deep love for the subject. These are the next 3 novellas I read, and I feel like these are the ones I can certainly hold up for the recently popular tag about trying to see what Steve Donahue hasn't read, which of course, like a lot of things, I think is somewhat of a cheat because these are 3 novellas from a small press. So it's not like they get a lot of play, but it's a local press, Mason Jar Press, and they publish novellas, and I'm writing a literary novella, so I wanted to give them a shout out, and I bought these 3 books at a reading that the authors did a few months ago, and I finally got around to reading them. It was an interesting reading experience because based on the readings the authors gave, I had a thought about which ones I'd like more than the others, but it's like my actual reading experience was a mirror image of that. Here's the first book I want to talk about, which I actually read second, The Couples by Nicole Calihan. And as she was reading, I found myself sort of distracted and not all that interested in the book, but I really liked it when I actually sat down to it. And Steve, this is the one that you should definitely read and, request and read, because it is a literary fiction novella about upper middle class divorce in Connecticut. Actually, it's not so much about the divorce part, but it really should be. It's about a bunch of couples that are together at a vacation home over a weekend when a storm hits, and particularly following one character whose birthday it is, who's having like a little bit of a middle-aged crisis and also sort of flashbacking to a traumatic event from her youth, while also engaging in various relationships, particularly with the adults around her. You know, it's very deep and navel-gazy, and maybe even I wouldn't like this level of, you know, self-reflection for too long, but I felt like this was a good length for it to, you know, take a dip into these characters' lives and their experiences. Though I am also biased in this direction of navel-gazy dramatic relationships. The first book I read was Manhunt by Jaime Fountaine, and I think in general the story is relatively stereotypical. It's about a young girl on the cusp of sort of sexual awakening and adolescence. It takes place during a summer when she is playing around with a bunch of neighborhood kids and just sort of trying to have a social life that won't extend into the school year. And yeah, speaking of the sexualness, you know, she has a bit of a flirtation, heavy petting session with one of the boys during a hide-and-seek game that goes on throughout the summer. And she has some girlfriends who are also, you know, experimenting with crushes and flirtation and girl talk. And then meanwhile, her mother is sort of a stereotypical single mother who gets involved with shady guys. And that also you know, it informs our main character, who is unnamed, her backstory and the way that people in the community view her and her mother. And on top of all of that, there is also a guy in a ski mask who goes driving around in his car and then showing people, you know, flashing his dick at people, you know, just staying in his car, but, you know, being lewd in that way. So yeah, there's a lot going on, and I feel like the elements are relatively stereotypical, but I liked the telling. I liked the voice of this, that it was so raw and real for this character, so I enjoyed it more than I thought I would. And finally, All Friends Are Necessary by Tomas Moniz was the story I thought I might like the most, because he read this really spirited excerpt of it and had us laughing at the reading. This is the shortest of the three. I think some people might even call it a long short story. It takes place in San Francisco over a summer a couple of years ago. It's very much informed by the politics of the time in a way, when neo-Nazis were running around America, as it were, and there's a march that was scheduled to happen in San Francisco at the time of this novella, but our narrator and his friends and a bunch of sort of quirky bohemian types end up squelching that. But really this is a bunch of vignettes about this rather alternative narrator guy. He's an artist, a metalhead, he's genderqueer, he has various relationships, sexual and otherwise, and he feels very close to people, but it's all sort of very fleeting. Again, it's about, you know, events that happen in a summer when he's doing this one temp job and before he goes on to his next temp job. But it seems to be a bit of an ode to this type of culture stuff, and I feel like that if you're not really invested in that culture, the writing style doesn't really give you a lot of favors. I just felt like in reading this I didn't connect to it as much as I thought I would, although I could certainly still appreciate some of the funny parts. And I'm glad that I got a little bit of a glimpse into a different sort of lifestyle than I usually see in fiction. And it certainly worked well in a novella form, or better than it would in a novel form, but ultimately I didn't connect to it as much as I did the other two. Okay, I guess I'll move on to my next small work, the middle grade work. This is SEEDFOLKS by Fleischman, and I actually picked up this book back in September. The DC Public Library does a month-long banned book scavenger hunt every year for the past few years, where they pick 6 books that have been banned in certain situations, usually with a theme attached to them, and we go hunting around library branches and local businesses to try and find them. So I found all 6 books. I, did some videos about it, but I also wanted to make sure that I made it a goal to read the 6 books before next September, and I figured I'd start now with the easiest thing to take off the list, the smallest of the books. This is the story of a neighborhood in Cleveland, And it's told in chapters by various people of a neighborhood. It starts with a young Vietnamese American girl who decides to clear out a part of like a junkyard area that used to be, you know, a green parkish area. She clears out a part to plant some lima bean seeds for her father's memory. And slowly and surely through the next few chapters, people take note of this and start to maintain a community garden together. And like the first few chapters are all a bit prescribed, like first this person gets involved and does this, and then that person gets involved and does that. But then we actually move on into more people sort of working together in tandem at the same time, and we see some emotional stories through these chapters. We have all sorts of people from the community. That, of course, is the point. Diversity in age and origin and experience. Some of the chapters are more sad than others. We have a Korean-American woman who had been assaulted, and the garden sort of takes her out of her trauma. And similarly, there's a young girl who got pregnant and it's rather messed up her life, but the garden gives her a little bit of relief as well. I'm not sure it's quite as trite as I'm making it out to be, although it certainly is more on the uplifting side and is, you know, for the kids to realize that working together gives you a sense of community and people start to get to know each other across all of these bounds. I don't know, I was thinking of Sesame Street a lot while I was reading this, like maybe this is the next step up, you know, from Sesame Street to this book to talk about urban living and getting along and making things green again, and I liked it. It was very cute. Next, I'll move on to the 3 books that I didn't really intend to read, but I just got a hankering to ever since the Goodreads Choice Awards were announced. They were books that were already on my radar, and I just felt compelled to want to read them to see if I would want to vote for them in the Goodreads Choice Awards. So the first one I read is Fleischman is in Trouble by Taffy Brodesser-Akner, which had been on my radar as a Jewish-themed book, but also has gotten a lot more acclaim in the broader community as well. It's a book that is primarily about and starts out about this middle-aged man recently divorced who is starting to procure like a new sex life for himself through texting apps and is generally trundling along at work and is about to receive a promotion. And things are going pretty well for him, and you know, he's out of a toxic marriage, but then his wife drops the kids off at his house on a day that isn't his, and then she completely disappears. So that starts to upend things for him. And we go back into the past of his life, and we discuss relationships, and we discuss his wants and dreams and how it you know, got tangled into, you know, his marriage and his kids and his job and all of that stuff. It's really about this one man, Toby Fleischman's life. But soon we get to understand that he is not the narrator of his life. His friend from college, Elizabeth, or Libby, is. And her life is actually very similar to Brodesser-Akner's life in that she is a features columnist for a magazine, and also is a middle-aged woman who is married with kids around the same age. And then the third part actually gives some voice to the ex-wife's situation. It's kind of like one of those novels where, you know, you see both sides of the marriage. I actually haven't read any of those other novels. I really liked this one, although I think I was arguing with Brodesser-Akner's thesis a little bit. Because the whole point of having Libby there was sort of to say that, you know, we care more about Toby and his story than we would about hers because she's a woman. But we never really get her story, and I just can't get past that, even though that's kind of the point. And I know that Brodesser-Akner, as a features columnist, kind of feels this from her job, because of course she can never put her own life into her articles, but she like puts a lot of her soul into them, and there's like a big poignant part of this novel where she talks about, through Libby, talks about the fact that, you know, when women talk about these human desires, you know, they're, you know, called narcissistic and, you know, shrill and all of that. And basically the only thing we're ever allowed to feel is like this sexism that is crowding up against us at all times, and since we can never get away from that sexism, we can never feel the things that men get to feel as just regular human beings. And I thought all of that was fascinating, but I still feel like it can't be Libby's story because she's not in it, and everything we learn about her is so stereotypical and like it can barely fit a novella. So I feel like I can't really answer the question about whether Libby's story would be more compelling than Toby's until we hear it, because I feel like it's not fair to say that Toby's story is entirely Libby's story, although they have some similarities. You have to give them that. That, you know, they're both sort of middle-aged and not happy with their lives and, you know, sort of at a crossroads about, where they are in their careers and so forth. Although really, I felt like the ex-wife Rachel's part was the part that proved that women are so easily consigned to these roles of evil bitch or what have you, when really they're far more complicated. And I feel like that's really where Brodesser-Akner succeeded. And I feel like I don't know, I'm struggling so much with talking about it, but Jennifer from Insert Literary Pun Here, of course, went online and made a video about something that I'm thinking about, and she expressed it all so much more beautifully about character and what character is. And you know, one way I think YA novels, which this isn't, succeed in a way that a lot of literary fiction doesn't, is that you really care about the characters. You know, they're real people to you. And I mean, I know they shouldn't be for, you know, outside of the book, but you can believe that they're real people. And sometimes I think literary fiction authors, or maybe even article writers, I don't know, write about characters more like they're ideas of people, you know, and we're supposed to be taken with them in a more scientifically removed way. Like, this is fascinating. It's like how a person could be, or we're thinking more about how the author creates them, and like, oh, the author put in so much nuance or something. I don't know, but we never really see them as people the way that so much in YA and maybe genre fiction, the characters actually, you know, you don't see the man behind the screen, you see the characters. But anyway, this was great. I loved it. I mean, she is such a competent, wonderful writer, and the world was so fleshed out and so real on so many different levels. And I think I might want to go to Brodesser-Akner if I ever have a problem with my liver, because it seems like she's done enough research to figure out what's wrong. You know, because that was Toby's job. Anyway, that's it. The next Goodreads Choice Award nominated book I read is A Woman Is No Man by Etaf Rum. And it was really interesting to read this right after Fleischman is in trouble, because in terms of women in society, there's a lot of parallels. I mean, the situation for the women in this book is very different, but in a general sense, there are similarities. So that basically women get shit in both novels if they ever deign to be anything that the men around them don't want them to be. It's just in this case, the situation is much more dire. These women are being physically and sexually abused and barely allowed to leave the house. So this is the story of 3 generations of Palestinian and Palestinian-American women, predominantly about the second 2 generations from the 1990s and 2008-2009. So we start with Isra, who was born and raised in Palestine, in Ramallah, and she is married off at 18, basically, to a man and his family who come to her parents, and they basically say, okay. And Isra's obviously not prepared for this, especially since they move away to Brooklyn, because the family has relocated to Brooklyn for the past couple of decades. But she's been brought up to believe that, you know, as a woman, your role is to be very subservient and often to be abused. So she doesn't really have much choice, but she has hope that maybe in America things would be better for her, except they're really not, because she's basically immediately shunted into the Brooklyn house and barely allowed to leave. And then in 2008, it's her daughter Dea's turn to be married in a traditional way to a man she hardly knows. But we get hints of things about what's happened to Isra in her life. Isra and her husband are actually dead in 2008. And both of these storylines are happening concurrently. So we find out, along with Dea, what really happened to her parents. The grandmother, Farida, was raised and lived for a long time in a refugee camp before she and her husband were able to save to go to America. And Farida, although she dealt with her own abuse as a younger woman, also upholds the system and can be pretty terrible to her daughters-in-law and her daughter by way of teaching them how to be good subservient women who won't rock the boat and get themselves into any more trouble. I'm really glad that Rum, who I think also was in an arranged marriage, although I don't know more than that, I'm glad she told this story. I feel like it's obvious from the telling that it's personal to her and raw and genuine. And of course she was nervous about playing into anti-Arab prejudices by, you know, digging up this dirt based on an abusive part of the society. I don't think I should go, I don't think I need to go much in here into the fact that, you know, one, you know, bad aspect doesn't mean the entire culture is horrible or something, you know, obviously. I think an area where I struggled a little bit was with the suggestion that because these people came from a horrible situation, that they were occupied, they were in camps, they don't have a state of their own, that justifies men mistreating women. And of course I have to acknowledge that I myself am a Zionist and have a lot of ties to the Jewish state, although I'm not negating the truth of the situations that these characters found themselves in, the injustices that they have faced. I just don't like the idea that that gives a free pass to more abuse. That after a while, sooner or later, we have to be responsible for our own actions. And I, you know, I go against the same thing whenever I read like Haredi memoirs about women in Haredi communities who escape similar abusive situations. And you know, Haredi, or specifically Hasidic communities, were decimated by the Holocaust. And in Brooklyn right now, Hasidic men are being attacked. One of them was put in the hospital a couple of weeks ago. So, you know, obviously, you know, injustice exists in various forms, but does that give carte blanche to more injustice? Like, where does it end? I think the real area, though, that this book didn't really succeed is that there's just not a lot of nuance to it. I ultimately felt like the story was pretty one-dimensional, and the writing was fair but not exemplary. And it's a shame because I feel like the seeds in this are something important. And I still really appreciated reading it and felt for the characters because of their situations. But Rincey from Rincey Reads recently held up this book as a book that disappointed her as well in terms of lack of nuance, so I'm glad I'm not alone in that aspect. And finally, the third Goodreads Choice Award book I picked up on audio. It's Miracle Creek, so there's a picture. Miracle Creek showed up in the mystery thriller category, which is a category I usually don't go into. It's not my genre. And this one is pretty much explained as a literary bent mystery thriller, that it's not only interested in the whodunit, it is interested in the whodunit, it's a courtroom drama, but it's also much more interested, I think, in the whys of how people behave. It's about a really heinous murder case. It's about two people who were killed in this horrible explosion, and for some background, they're all part of this treatment called HBOT treatment, where people go into like a submarine type facility and get strapped in to breathe pure oxygen, and it's supposed to help them with various ailments. It's actually an experimental treatment for such things as male infertility and autism and cerebral palsy, all the things that patients in this book have. This particular HBOT treatment center is run by a Korean-American family, so that brings together a whole lot of the author's personal backstory, that she was an immigrant from Korea as a teenager to America, and she also was a litigation lawyer, so man, those courtroom scenes! It was like watching Varys and Littlefinger in Game of Thrones. It was intense. Then also she was the parent of children with who benefited from this experimental treatment, so she had been to HBOT treatment. So we follow the trial and we go into the past and the present of various characters. It's a multi-POV story, and I loved it. I think it especially gave voice to the parents of special needs kids, and just how difficult and complicated it can be to parent these children, and you know, to always have to seem like a good mother. It's kind of similar again to the idea that women always are forced into these roles. Like, if you're not completely happy with being a mother all the time, then you're the devil. Like, if you never have any doubts or, you know, frustrations, oh my God. It also goes into, you know, the difficulties of being an immigrant in this country, although I kind of feel like Kim did better with that in the backstory than she did in the present day, which kind of mucked things up a little bit, but I might be being too picky with that. I think I am. But one of the things I really liked about listening to the audiobook is a major thing that Kim touched upon was how adults who immigrate and don't know the language, you know, they're immediately infantilized by the fact that they can't speak English in this country. And it really, you know, does a number on their self-esteem. And a nice part about having a narrator for the story means that when the characters were speaking in Korean versus when they were speaking English, you know, that she spoke with different inflections. So it's like you could kind of get an understanding of who they were in each language. And I really liked that. I think what I ultimately like the most about this story, though, is it's about redemption. And I mean that to say that what happened was not an accident. But it also wasn't a mustache twirling event, like, I'm just, well, I mean, the person on trial is Elizabeth, the mother, and it's not like, as, the prosecutor tries to make it, it's not a case of her being an evil mother who's sick of her kid and tries to kill him, and that's it. Everyone's feelings and emotions and backstories are complicated, and they weigh on the people, and so even though they make horrible mistakes, that doesn't mean that, they're horrible people. And ultimately, when the people most responsible for what happened are confronted with it, they try to be better. They try to move past it. And I mean, they have to acknowledge it and, pay penance for it, but then they, want to be better people in the future. So I really appreciated that. That's a major part of my own novella that I'm writing. So I love seeing it done well somewhere else where it's not about either cloyingness or about evil villains. It's about complicated people in the middle. I really like that part. So I'm really glad I finally got to it. The second audiobook I listened to has been on my Goodreads TBR for a few years now. It is Looking for Alaska by John Green. This is the third Green novel I've read, and it's the one I think is in the middle. I don't like it as much as A Fault in Our Stars, but I do think it's better than Paper Towns, even though it has some of similar aspects. This is Green's first novel. My phone is annoying me. Anyway, the protagonist, Miles, decides to go to boarding school for the last 2 years of high school because he wants to embrace the great perhaps, which is, final last words of somebody, whoever. And he isn't really all that happy at his school at home, so he decides, time for a fresh start. He meets a cast of your usual Dawson's Creek-esque John Green characters, including an enigmatic girl named Alaska. The first half of the book didn't work as well for me. I don't think, in this case, I don't think the narrator did any favors. Like, the way that he did the voices was so cartoonish. And I've had trouble now with, the female lead in Paper Towns and the female lead here, although I think she works better here. I just like how her story pans out better here, I think. It feels more real. And I get what John Green is trying to do in saying that she's so enigmatic because the narrator whose head we're in doesn't know her that well. He doesn't see her as a person, so it's like we don't get to see her as a person. But I still feel like there's just some lack of nuance. Like I just never was sold on Miles's interest in her entirely, because she was just... But in the second half of the story, there's a big tragedy, and it becomes more about, an exploration of grief and trying to understand depression and that sort of thing through an interesting religion class and through poetry and final words. And, it was much more touching and real to me in that second half. So I feel like that made up for the first half quite a bit. And I'm curious to watch the Hulu adaptation. I think I'll write about it in my reading writing blog after I do. And I imagine that the adaptation will, smooth out some of the edges of this book and maybe make it more palatable. But still, I liked it. I like most things. I'm glad I gave it a chance. And finally, I just finished this book. This is Echo North by Joanna Ruth Meyer. It is her sophomore YA fantasy novel. It's gotten a lot more acclaim than her first one. But I first knew Joanna Ruth Meyer, vaguely, through a NaNoWriMo Vidler community. So actually, I'd hoped to read this novel earlier in the year. I got it back in January, but it felt kind of apropos to read it in November. This is a fairy tale retelling of East of the Sun, West of the Moon, about a young girl who is enchanted by a wolf, or basically tricked by a wolf to live in his home with him, his magical home with him, in exchange for her father's life. And throughout the year, she bonds with the wolf, and she also bonds with a young man who she meets in these enchanted mirror books, where she goes on adventures and meets other readers, or two other readers, and falls in love with the boy Hal and wants to save him because it becomes apparent that he's trapped in the books. So she has a year in this kooky magical house The wolf and Hal are trapped by a evil sorceress called the Wolf Queen. They made promises to her, but they can't really talk about it with Echo. And anyway, her part in all of this is to look after the house for a year, and then the wolf will go on to the next step of his journey. I don't think I like this as much as her first book. I felt like the details of her relationships, well, you know, she has an evil stepmother, and then her relationship with the wolf, I felt like, you know, it was, well, the wolf was in no way menacing, but so maybe that was a reason she got her Stockholm Syndrome so early on and wanted to save him. And also there's some reasons for it that we find out later in the story, so I might have to give it that. But in the moment I felt like things were moving too quickly and too conveniently, and she was trying to get through her plot too quickly. I take that back, not her plot, but her relationship development, which in a way irks me even more. I really would like to believe more in characters and relationships than I did for a long part of this. And Echo herself is, you know, she's pretty flat as a character, you know. She has no flaws. I mean, her biggest flaw is that she makes mistakes sometimes, and maybe that's enough to turn some readers against her, but it's not enough for me to hate her or to, you know, make her seem like a, you know, three-dimensional person. She's mostly just an innocent, brave, young girl. She also has some scars, which, you know, are important to the story, especially more so as it goes on. Although in terms of disfigurement in fairy tales, I think Jen Campbell would like how this one ultimately turns out. I do, but where Joanna Ruth Myers continues to shine is in her world building. The house with all of the weird rooms of binding the library to the house with thread, or watering vines with water and sunlight you collect from the water and sun rooms. I don't know, it was really kooky and really fun. And then when Echo leaves the house to go on more of a journey, we learn more about the mystical forces behind everything, and I really like those aspects of the world building. They felt magical, and it was fun to go on that journey and journey with Echo. And there was a little bit of a price to pay at the end, which I liked, and also there was a secondary villainous character who had a little more dimension than I thought she would, so I was happy with that. And I felt for her relationships with her father and brother, I guess. I mean, I really did enjoy it. I'm glad I read it. But I think sometimes one reason I might prefer non-fairy tale retelling epic fantasies to fairy tale retelling ones is that it seems like people tend to go into more detail with characterization and even with world building of the non-magical kind. Although kudos to the fact that, you know, this is a fantasy and the magic is there, because, you know, sometimes some fantasy stories barely have any magic, so that is definitely not an issue with this. So that about covers it for me now. I'm pretty sure I gave all of these books 4 stars, but Miracle Creek is probably my favorite. And again, you can find my written reviews for all of these books through my literary newsletter link. And now it's December, and that's freaky, and where has the year gone? Maybe I've talked it away through this video. I will be back soon to talk more about my bookish exploits. I'm very excited after, you know, largely ignoring it for NaNoWriMo to talk more again about the books I am reading as I read them rather than at the end of the month. Although, man, to do it all in one sitting like this makes me seem pretty prolific. But anyway, hope you're having a good start to the end of 2019. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.